Hi, Megan, a bookseller at Literati Bookstore and the host for tonight's event. This evening, we're pleased to welcome Erika Schickel and Meghan Daum to our At Home with Literati series in support of The Big Hurt. For attendees, the chat is closed, but I will be dropping links to purchase The Big Hurt throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature in your toolbar to submit questions at any time, and a selection of them will be asked at the conclusion of the event. A reminder that you can shop for more books in-store at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup and shipping to your home anywhere in the United States. Now allow me to introduce tonight's author and moderator. Erika Schickel's essays and criticism have appeared in the Los Angeles Times, Los Angeles Review of Books, Chicago Tribune, and more. She's the author of You're Not the Boss of Me, Adventures of a Modern Mom. She's also a trained actress and has provided the voice for a variety of animated characters. She's written and performed a number of one-woman shows and a radio play with the LA Theater Works series, The Place Within. Erika lives outside of Los Angeles, California. Meghan Daum is the author of 5 books, most recently The Problem with Everything, My Journey Through the New Culture Wars, a New York Times notable book for 2019. Her collection of original essays, The Unspeakable and Other Subjects of Discussion, won the 2015 Penn Center USA Award for Creative Nonfiction. A Los Angeles Times opinion columnist from 2005 to 2016, Meghan has written for numerous magazines, including The New Yorker and Vogue. Meghan is a recipient of a 2015 Guggenheim Fellowship and a 2016 National Endowment for the Arts grant. Is on the adjunct faculty of the Writing Division at Columbia University School of the Arts. She also teaches private workshops and personal essay and memoir out of her home in person and online. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Erika and Meghan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks for having us. I'm sorry we can't be in Ann Arbor, but
I know.
Next best thing.
I have winter wear going to waste here, when I could be in Ann Arbor.
I love doing events with bookstores that are that I've never been to. It's like Zoom events with all these places. Like I did one in Milwaukee, and that was exciting. So it's great to be in Ann Arbor. Yes. Anyway, so Erika, congratulations again on The Big Hurt. This is the second time we've spoken.
Mm-hmm.
We're on my podcast, The Unspeakable, several months ago. I think it was earlier this fall. Just so everybody knows what the book is about, in general, it's about growing up in an eccentric, fractured literary family. Much mayhem ensues. You get seduced by a teacher in high school. That leads you to getting kicked out of boarding school. A number of kind of patterns get established, and you end up sort of repeating yourself in middle age. And we won't give away too much, but needless to say, this book is about a lot of things. And I guess maybe a good place to start is what place you started. When did you start writing this book? I know it was a long journey and it had many iterations. So maybe you could kind of just briefly take us through the different permutations of this project.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The book took me about 12 years to write. I started it in 2008, the year after my first book, You're Not the Boss of Me, came out, which was a funny collection of mommy essays. And I decided that my next book would be about this experience, about going to this bohemian boarding school in the Berkshire Mountains in Massachusetts from 1978 to 82. Which was, for the most part, a wonderful experience. I had been sort of raised in privileged neglect in Manhattan and was sort of booted off to boarding school by my narcissistic parents. And the school saved me. It was a fantastic experience. It became my family and my community. And then 6 weeks before graduation, I was seduced by the music teacher at the school. And I got kicked out, and I buried the story. So when I went back to look at it, thinking I was going to write another funny book about high school this time, and I started to really look at the story, I saw that, in fact, it wasn't a funny story at all. It was a really sad story, and that I had sort of buried it and run away from it for a long, long time. And the act of confronting the story triggered a number of events that are also what the book is about.
When you say you were seduced by the music teacher, you're not talking about like this was a consensual relationship to some degree. Like, let's talk about what that relationship was like, because I think for probably a lot of people under a certain age, it's a little bit inconceivable how I don't think it wasn't commonplace, but it certainly wasn't necessarily totally shocking that a girl in high school would be involved with an adult man, whether or not he was a teacher. So let's talk a little bit about the kind of cultural and sexual landscape of this. Was the 70s still, or were we?
Yeah, I mean, it was still effectively the 70s. I mean, the affair happened in 1982. But let me just say that he was not the first adult man that I had a sexual relationship with in high school. There was a pattern already that was not just in my personal life, but all around me, reflected in the culture and reflected in the school's culture, and reflected in my family, my parents' attitude towards adult relationships and so on, which is this sort of expectation at the time for girls to be very, very sophisticated. And I was excellent at that. I was raised to be super smart and sophisticated and sort of a lovely adornment to any male life, So a pattern had been set when this guy came along, so that when he did come along, even though I didn't really return, I had a crush on him, but I did not love him or feel like we should have a relationship. I just had a crush on him. But because it had already happened to me, I felt like it was expected of me to enter into the relationship with him.
So talk about who your parents were. You were growing up in Manhattan. You went to the Dalton School. We'll talk about what that is. But your father was a writer. Your mother was
a writer,
actress,
as well.
A writer.
Yeah. My father was a noted film critic named Richard Schickel, who wrote for Time magazine for many, many years, and was an author of many books about film and television and film history and so forth. And my mother was a novelist and an essayist and a journalist, whose career was more or less upended by the birth of me. Her writing career never panned out for a variety of reasons, but there was always a certain amount of tension between us. And as I reached puberty, that only increased, so that by the time I was about to start high school, my mother I was a troubled kid. My parents divorced when I was 12. It was the 70s. And so I ran amok, and that's why they sent me off to boarding school. And I had a younger sister whom I was separated from at that time and didn't actually rediscover until I was in my 20s.
But when you say you ran amok, what do you mean?
Shoplifting and, boys and smoking cigarettes and smoking dope, the usual roster of crap that kids do.
Okay, but even that sort of dereliction aside, a lot of what is so fascinating about the book is the way you describe just the way childhood and adolescence was in that time. I mean, we talk about this concept of benign neglect. I think you just called it privileged neglect. I think it was a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I mean, even in Manhattan, which was not safe, in terms of crime and all that, at that time, there still was just a kind of assumption that kids could take care of themselves, and that being sophisticated intellectually also translated into somehow being able to take care of yourself in terms of your safety and just making judgment.
Yeah, I mean, and everybody sort of understands the rap about Gen X. That's become very sort of like in the conversation right now about how Gen X is this generation of, kids who just fell between the cracks of like the baby boom and the next generation. And I was actually born in 1964. I think Gen X starts at 65. And I've even heard my year at like 63, 64 referred to as Generation Jones, which is like Yeah, I
I've
know,
never
it's
heard, that sounds
crazy.
like a cult, like
But
a,
it's like a subgroup of, it's like an even smaller slice. So like my parents were solid baby boomers, right? And I was
they were
sort of,
baby boomers, or
well,
they're
no,
too old for that.
they were actually a little too old. That's true.
They
But they were
acted like, but they
raised,
acted like baby
they
boomers.
were coming
Yeah.
of age during the time of in the 50s, So so they had all of those mores, all of those social settings, and then I can't remember what comes after Gen X, but my
Millennials,
case
right?
is, I think maybe, but anyway, so it's just sort of this weird little subset, and we got sort of kicked to the curb and, latchkey, unsupervised. And in New York, my parents were just, cultural capital was the thing in my family, writing and being smart and having references and having read books and seen all the films and been to all the art events. That was what was of value. Being funny was of value in my family. And, other stuff just wasn't expressed, like deep affection and fealty and things like that. So it was a strange upbringing for sure. And so, which primed me for the Buxton School when they sent me. I really needed that structure, and it was great.
Well, I want to have you read a little bit from the book. Also, just for the audience, we're going to be taking questions at a quarter to the hour, so at 7:45 Eastern time. So if you have questions, either put them in the chat now or hang on to them.
Yeah, I see somebody saying Adam Curry was just talking about that yesterday. The 63 to 64 kids were on the cusp. It's really true. Joe, oh, that's Joan. Yay. Yeah, it's really true. That was a weird time.
But wait, anyway, where does Generation Jones come from? Is that like Jonestown? Seriously?
I don't know. Maybe. I just read it. I read it a few weeks ago and I was like, oh, all right. Because a friend of mine always calls me Jones because I used to be an actress. So he always calls me Jones. And I was like, oh, Generation Jones. That tracks. Yeah.
Wow, that's the first. Okay. All right. Well, we'll read a little bit from the book.
I will. Okay, just in case people have reading anxiety, because I have reading anxiety, I'm reading a 9-minute segment from this book. Big Hurt, New York, late fall 1978. We got 3 free weekends each year in addition to winter and spring breaks. That fall home weekend, I stayed with Amy at her parents' apartment in the Dakota. Oh, just a sidebar. So we're home from the Buxton School. And this is my roommate at Buxton, Amy. At her parents' apartment in the Dakota, the famous double-spired Central Park West apartment building where Rosemary's Baby had been filmed, home to many cultural icons from Lillian Gish to Joe Namath. The apartment was cavernous, with wide hallways, dark servants' quarters, dumb waiters. Amy's room lay in utter disarray beneath vaulted ceilings. Sex Pistols, Clash, and Elvis Costello posters obscured dark scroll work. A window seat was piled with laundry. Walk-in closets burst with Norma Kamali dresses and Betsy Johnson separates. Amy's mother had married the famous theater producer, Arthur Cantor, and Amy's room was a glorious illustration of the kind of gorgeous excess that parental guilt could yield. Amy and I were sprawled on her bed with magazines when there was a knock at the door. "Identify," Amy called out. "Max Cantor," said a low voice. "You may enter," Amy commanded without looking up from her Vogue. Max was Amy's stepbrother. He had graduated from Buxton the year before I got there. He was a brilliant, charismatic kid with the kind of energy that would probably get him an ADHD diagnosis today. Max was tall with alabaster skin under wiry dark hair. He was innocently unkempt, as though he had not been taught the habit of bathing regularly. Nevertheless, he was stupidly handsome. He had a Nerf football in his long-fingered hands as he tossed and spun it idly. He looked around the room, seeming to see nothing of much interest. Then he looked at us. "Want to go smoke a joint on the roof?" Amy and I jumped up, stuck our feet in our shoes, and followed him out the door. Max was obsessed with the Dakota and its history and gave us a guided tour. "Construction on the building began October 25th, 1880. Max punched the elevator button. "It was finished 4 years later, almost to the day on October 28th, 1884. It was designed by the same architectural firm that did the Plaza Hotel. The elevator arrived, operated by a wizened black man who had the look of a burnished newel post. "Clive, my man," Max said, high-fiving the guy, acting all Mr. Cool. "Maximilian," the elevator guy said. "Take us to the top, Clive." "Straight up, all aboard." We got on and Clive closed the outer door, then the inner gate. He gyrated an ornate brass handle that sent the elevator smoothly skyward. Amy and I reposed on a velvet bench beneath a smoked mirror, watching the floors of the Dakota shudder past the elevator's gate. Clive slowed the car expertly, so we didn't even feel the slightest jerk to a stop. "Penthouse, Mr. Cantor." The penthouse apartment had enormous double doors and deep carpeting in the hallway. Max led us over to a small service door and up a flight of stairs. Above the penthouse floor of the Dakota was a separate maze of narrow, whitewashed hallways like you'd find on a ship. These passageways were for the servants so they could circulate through the building without bothering the residents, Max explained, leading us down the winding corridors and finally choosing a door. He pushed it open and we stepped out into the brisk October night. I'd been on many roofs in my time. I had danced on sizzling hot tar paper from the Bowery to Park Avenue. I had seen pigeon coops and swimming pools, laundry lines and Zen gardens, but I had never seen or imagined a roof like this one. It was a city unto itself, a riot of vents and spires, flights of iron steps leading to different levels. The famous pointed dormers, which were fetching accents from the street, stood like small witch huts, arched and spandreled. Max led us over to a filigreed balustrade that lay like widow's lace against the rising moon. Central Park spread before us like dirty burlap, its lights winking up at us through naked trees. We could see all of it from Harlem to 59th Street. They named it the Dakota because it was as remote as the Dakotas. Nothing else was here when it was built. Max led us into the windbreak of a turret and pulled a Sucrets tin out of his pocket. It held a number of pre-rolled joints. He lit one and took a deep drag, speaking as he held his hit. "The building was commissioned by Edward Clark, the head of the Singer Sewing Machine Company." Skip. Wait, sorry, here we go. I almost couldn't bear how attractive I found Max. He was exactly the kind of boy I liked. I was drawn to teenage dungeon masters and conspiracy theorists with keen encyclopedic intelligences, low GPAs, and deep brown eyes. Boys so burdened by their own brilliant complexity that they dedicated their days to killing as many brain cells as possible in a misguided attempt to suffer less. I alone understood their pain and shared their interests. I could meet them on the field of their dreams, and I felt called to enact their fantasies with them. "Max, I'm freezing my ass off," Amy said, hopping in place, flicking her cigarette butt over the edge of the railing. "The joint was just mood enhancement, ladies. It's not what we came for. Follow me." Max led us around a long, winding path that described the view of the building. He turned his lecture to all the famous people who had lived at the Dakota, from Leonard Bernstein to Rudolf Nureyev, as we went up and down tiny staircases through passageways over to the western arm of the building and to the inner balustrade that had a gut-churning view down to the courtyard below. All of the apartments in the Dakota were laid out so that the living rooms were given the park and city views, and the service rooms looked out over the courtyard. It was just after 8, and we could see the shapes of people moving around in their kitchens, getting dinner ready or cleaning it up. Lives stacked into a grid, each with its own flickering blue light, everyone caught up in the mundane cycle of daily life. I wondered what could possibly be of interest here, but it didn't matter because Max had come up right behind me. "See where that gutter runs?" Max pointed to a vertical pipe running down the inside of the building. I felt the heat of him down my back, and every inch of my skin burst into goosebumps. "One window down from the roof and 3 windows left from the gutter." He put his head close to mine and pointed over my shoulder. I could smell him, a bouquet of sinsemilla and camel straights, Shetland sweater and boy funk. I tried to keep my heavy breathing from becoming audible. I focused my eyes and counted over and down to a kitchen window where a female figure stood at the sink, looking down. I couldn't see her hands or face as her long dark hair was in the way, but clearly she was rinsing dishes and couldn't push it back. A shadowy figure moved around in the next room next to her, but the lights weren't as bright in that room. I couldn't make out who it was. Max, Amy moaned. This is stupid. You're already in trouble with the building for this shit. Max handed me a small pair of binoculars. Here, get a really good gander. I pressed the cold oculars to my eyes and dialed in the focus. The person in the dining room had shoulder-length hair, but I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman until he walked into the kitchen carrying some dishes. Do you see? It was a man. He put down the dishes on the counter beside the sink, reached over and pushed the woman's hair out of her face. It was a tender gesture, and I could feel its warmth even at that distance. The man stood behind the woman and put his arms around her, stepping into the light over the sink. And I saw that he was tall and narrow-framed, with shoulder-length shaggy hair and round glasses. The details rearranged themselves suddenly into iconography, and I understood who I was looking at. It was John Lennon and Yoko Ono. Max was standing behind me, his breath in my ear. This was the thing I wanted. To be that close with someone that deep, that warm, that brilliant, even if our love was as misunderstood and maligned as John and Yoko's. I would give anything for that.
What an amazing scene. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for reading that. It looks like you just took a huge swig of vodka or something.
I drink water out of a vintage gin bottle. It's an old
Okay.
Gordon's gin bottle.
I think that's a good shtick. You know, so much of this book, there's such incredible, it's beyond fondness. You still are in awe of the New York that you grew up in, but you're aware of its dangers and its toxicities, to use an overused word. Are you glad that you grew up when and where you did, on balance?
Yeah, I mean, I got to grow up in one of the great cities of the world. So, on one level, it was a super enriched childhood, and a lot of who I am and how I perceive the world comes through that city. And, and a lot of that is in the book. I write a lot about, there's a whole chapter I write about that book, The Family of Man, which was, very sort of New York centric book, of its time, because it was published by the Met and all that. Anyway, I feel very identified with it, even though I haven't lived there in 30 years. It never stops being a part of you,
So one of the things that happened in your family was that your parents split up and basically each of them took a kid. Your father took your sister and your father picked you. And so you have this relationship with your father that's, at once there's something extraordinary about it. The letters back and forth, you include a lot of the letters that he's written to other people about you. He's looking after you in a certain way, but also ignoring you in a lot of ways. And you're functioning as his you are his confidant and vice versa. Yes. But maybe you could talk a little bit about that relationship dynamic and how it maybe did or did not resemble your actual intimate relationships with men.
Well, my father was a hell of a guy. He was a very complex, interesting man. And, before I say anything else, I loved him to the bottom of my heart, and he loved me to the bottom of his. That was never in question. That said, he was a fairly shit father. He always stood up for me and he always showed up when the chips were down, but he abandoned me a lot. He just sort of, he did not, in the way of the benign narcissist, he just did not understand how to empathize or see the world through my eyes or understand what would be good for his kid. So he sort of raised me to be his little sidekick, so, and he was very uninterested in both of us, me and my sister, until we reached puberty, until I could have a conversation with him, and talk about a movie with him. I mean, that was the nature of our relationship. And it was deeply satisfying on that level. And then, in terms of my Oedipal urges, the relationship that I have in this book. So the second part of this book is about this affair that I engage in middle age with a guy I call Sam Spade in the book, but is in fact James Ellroy, the crime writer. And that was a deeply, deeply Oedipal relationship in both directions. Ellroy, who was famously, his mother was famously murdered when he was 10 years old. So he was looking for the beautiful, pale, redheaded mother figure. I too was looking for the beautiful, pale, redheaded mother figure in my own mother, who I lost when I was about 12, for different reasons.
Not literally.
Emotionally, not literally. She did not die then, but
Yeah.
she pushed me out of the nest. And became my enemy, which was weird. And Ellroy and my father were very similar in many ways. And then they were these big mid-century writers with many books under their belts, and, had published in the great heyday of publishing and wrote in first draft and, the whole thing. So there was a lot going on there that, he offered.
Well, so how did you incorporate the Sam Spade narrative with the backstory? Because there's the book, they work well together, they're integrated, but there are definitely two different tracks going on.
They didn't work well together for a very long time, but I was bullheaded that as I said, I started out writing this boarding school story. And then as a way to sort of avoid confronting what really happened to me in high school, I thought it would be easier to break up my marriage and have a love affair with a notorious crazy crime writer. And doing that, forced me back into the story. I realized that I was repeating the story with this man, that because I was so unwilling to look at what happened, subconsciously, I was being made to re-experience it. So the love of an inappropriate older pedagogic man, the being kicked out. When I told my husband what was going on, he threw me out of the house, and I was sort of cast out of respectable society. I mean, in terms of my professional and personal relationships, all got turned upside down. I went into the second exile of my life. So the more I lived it, the more I went, holy shit, this is all one story. This is one story. How am I going to write this as one story? And it took me a long, long time to find the formula. I knew it had to be a toggle structure, and I did a ham-fisted attempt at that. There were many drafts. And then finally my editor at Hachette figured out the missing sequence, and it all fell together, and it was great.
What was the missing sequence?
I can't even remember offhand now, but there was a lot of it had to do with the CJ reveal. There's a story in there about my best friend from high school who contacted me in 2008, and I hadn't talked to him in years and years. And he was the one who said to me, Erika, something terrible happened to you at Buxton, and all those years I was like, no, this was my fault. I was in love with him. I totally, and he was like, you were a child. This was not right, and he was the one who opened the whole can of worms for me. So I tell his story, and his story is strangely relevant to my story. It sort of adds this weird dimension to it. So
talk about this incident at Buxton. We don't have to give too much away, but talk about sort of how this relationship evolved. You did get kicked out, but the relationship did not end then.
No.
And it's pretty extraordinary. You're what, 17, 18?
No,
and
I was just 18.
Okay, and this is an adult.
33.
And Right. And not only do you sort of continue the relationship after you get thrown out, your mother is actually into it. She's
She is.
psyched about it.
Yeah. So my mother and I were horribly estranged until I got kicked out of school. And she was living at that time on Cape Cod. And she was like, come here, darling, come to my bosom, you know.
She likes it when you have to be rescued, that you get that.
Well, she likes the damsel in distress scenario. Right. And it was one that she did a lot in her life. So I went down there and, you know, and she was very welcoming, and shared with me that when she was at Sarah Lawrence, she too had slept with her teacher. And this becomes another piece of the story where I learned that I am actually the third generation of women in my family to sleep with their teacher, that this was a thing that had happened twice before in my lineage. So I sort of look at that, and my mother died sadly in 2016. And so I haven't, you know, I asked her a lot of questions about that, but there was a lot I didn't know. And so it's me sort of trying to piece that together, and this sort of epigenetic piece of that, you know, not so much like, oh, well, my mother slept with a teacher, and so I knew subconsciously to do the same thing. It was more like my mother's sadness seeped into me, you know, whether it was a blood-brain barrier seepage in the womb or being raised by her. But I took a lot of that on in my life. And she was very, very captivated by masculinity and powerful masculinity. And those were values that she passed to me. So it was sort of like I was being set up by her without her even knowing it, you know? Yeah.
So interesting.
That's really crazy.
I mean, one of the things that people really responded to after our podcast interview posted was just the way that time, the 70s and the 80s, and I think you and I talked about this as well, it was a strange moment because the sexual revolution was in full swing, and yet the women's movement hadn't quite sort of galvanized itself to combat the forces of the sexual revolution. So there was this kind of illusion of women having agency, but really they were kind of going along with what they thought they should be taking pleasure in.
Yes. And there was, think of it, I mean, there was no context yet in women's experience or minds for what that pleasure might look like or how to handle the changing rules. You know, I say in the book, you know, my mother had been raised with the sort of factory settings of the 1950s. And then suddenly, you know, and she got married and she had kids and she was doing all of those things right. And then suddenly here comes the sexual revolution. And, you know, and my parents had a zeitgeist divorced. I mean, it was like they divorced in 76. So, you know, that was really in New York. It was all the divorces were just starting to happen, you know. And so I think that she didn't, you know, I think she feel like she got a bad deal somehow, you know, that she sort of went into motherhood when really maybe she should have taken more time for herself and to find herself and her career and all of that. But that wasn't something that women did. And I think that some of that resentment was passed down to the kids. And by the kids, I don't just mean me and my sister, but sort of the kids of my generation, you know, that our moms sort of missed a step. Do you know what I mean? And it was sort of like this awkward fumble that sort of, you know,
I think it's so hard. That particular cohort, they were in a really, really tough spot. There was no winning. I think about this vis-a-vis Hillary Clinton a lot. Like she was absolutely, you know, she was that generation. She was only going to get married. It would have been very, you would have to be a real outlier at that time to not get married.
Yes.
When she did, and to not have a child. I mean, it's not that nobody did anything different than that, but it was not the norm.
Yeah.
So you actually ended up having a relatively conventional life as a married woman. You moved to Los Angeles. You really, you set up a life for yourself that is pretty much the polar opposite of the life that your parents had. So tell us about that.
Yeah, well, my goal by the time I graduated college, and I was so, and here I'm going to use the word trauma, but I mean, I really was sort of traumatized by having been thrown out of school. And then I did go and live with the teacher in Bennington for about 6 weeks, and then he dumped me.
But he also like
cruelly.
left his wife and went off with you at age 18, and like you
took his 18-year-old girlfriend and we set up house. Yes, it's so crazy.
And your mother was into it. Like, you have my
yes, my father wouldn't talk to me, and he was the source of the money, so he cut me off. So we were totally broke. My mom was, you know, she was supportive, but that doesn't mean like she came to see me in Bennington or anything like that. You know, I mean, it was just like we weren't fighting that summer. That was good. And I was, you know, with this man, and sort of the projection started to fade, you know, between us. And he just, I think, found himself with an emotionally sort of distressed child bride, you know. I mean, it must have been a fucking nightmare for him, and it wasn't great for me either. But I knew, but I mean, at that point, I'd been so conditioned by life to just cling to anybody who would love me, you know, that I was gonna, you know, I was 100% committed to the relationship when he just cruelly dumped me. And suddenly and out of the blue. And then that was it. And he said, you know, your dad's coming to get you. And then we drove back to the house, and there was my dad. And I never saw the man again. And I have never spoken to him since. So yeah, I was really like set up for this insane, you know, I was very broken by the time I got out of college. So I came straight to California, and my whole goal was like normalcy. And, you know, I'm the first like reasonable, normal, non-crazy man I met, I married. You know, I just wanted to bury myself and be good. I wanted to prove to the world that I was good, not a dirty, fucked up lunatic. So.
And it worked for a long time.
For about 10 years, it was great. And we had those nice babies together, and we had a really amicable marriage. And then the second 10 years was we just drifted farther and farther apart. And, you know, just the differences between us and our styles and what we cared about it was like any tanker of a marriage. It just sad and sexless, and it tanked, you know, so. And then I pulled the plug on it by having an extramarital affair, which somebody generally does in these situations.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, you know, infidelity is a great go-to.
Yeah. Well, it's very efficient.
Yeah.
It's a very efficient.
Gets the job done. Yeah.
Sabotaging oneself. So we're going to take questions in a few minutes, but I wanted to just make sure I asked you, what kind of responses have you gotten to the book since we last spoke? I think we spoke on the podcast maybe in September or October. Yeah. So, you know, a couple of months have passed. I know people were totally fascinated by your story. So what kinds of things have people said to you? What surprised you?
Well, I mean, it's been an amazing response. I was so terrified before I brought this book out, because it is so personal, and the response has been so warm and enthusiastic, and just a lot of people just connecting to the story, finding themselves inside of the story, men and women both. And obviously, if you're a woman over the age of 45, like, this book is 100% for you. But I'm also getting responses from women in their 20s, who are really, experience of having, recognizing their own experience in a slightly different era. And that's been so gratifying. And then I've heard from people at Buxton and, abuse victims and stuff like that. And that feels like a heavy responsibility, to take that on in from somebody, but also a sacred and sort of lovely kind of trust between us. So, all kinds of great, and good reviews, good critical response. I'm very happy with all of it.
Have you had conversations with people about kind of how they frame the concept of trauma or the idea of being a victim? I mean, you've talked very honestly about what you went through, and there's some stuff we haven't touched on in this conversation, like pretty brutal experiences. But you never see yourself as a victim. It's really sort of not part of your emotional vocabulary. And yet you're writing this book and bringing it out in the time of Me Too. We are framing these discussions very differently than anybody did, certainly back then. I'm curious, have you had sort of intergenerational discussions about what people consider trauma, what people consider something that they can move past, as opposed to
I'm really grateful for the conversation around trauma. And I have to say, it's been interesting because when I started writing this book, I mean, one of my central problems was, I was going to write a funny book, and now it's this sad book in which I am the victim of something. Like, fuck that.
There's really funny things in it, though, we should say.
Yeah, there are.
I LOL'd.
Yes, yes. I am at first a humor writer, and then everything comes after. But yeah, I began to understand, like, I'm really going to have to negotiate with this. And I think, I was said earlier where I was listening to this Barry Weiss podcast about trauma. She had a guy on who has done big studies on trauma, psychologist, and he was sort of talking about resiliency and how people bounce back from bad situations. And, I think that I was very lucky in that, I had some tools, like I had social skills and other things that I could rely on. I compartmentalized a lot for many years. I used to tell the story of being kicked out of boarding school like it was a joke, and I think that it's, in the course of writing the book, the conversation has really developed around that. And I read The Body Keeps the Score after the book published, all of that. And I'm like, that is me. And I have to acknowledge, it was my experience, and I was damaged by it, and I'm not going to ever say that I'm glad that it happened, because I think that my life would have been very different in some very good ways had all of this stuff not happened to me. But on the other hand, it's like being from New York. I mean, I can't separate it from myself, I mean, I love New York. It sucks. I never want to live there again. I can't get it out of my system. It's the same with trauma. It's like, it's good to understand it, the terms of it, and have language for it and a conversation that you can join in around it. And it's also good to just put it down and think about something else.
Yeah, well, I'm actually glad you circled back to getting kicked out of school, because somebody has a question about it. Actually, there's 3 questions. There's at least 3 questions, and they're all sort of interrelated. So I'll ask one of them first. Anonymous attendee asks, how did you end up being kicked out of school? I know it was a different time, but what reasoning did they use, since the teacher was the one in the authority position? So what were the mechanics of that?
Yeah, so I say kicked out. Legally, I was not expelled, because they could not expel me. I was still their responsibility legally. And the way they presented it to me, first of all, it was presented in a one-on-one conversation with a teacher that I was very close with. And she sort of gave me the verdict from the administrative committee, the school's administrative committee, who had decided that the teacher, his wife, was the French teacher, and she wanted to finish the semester. And I was told that if I stayed in the school, it would make her uncomfortable and other students uncomfortable, and that it would be better for everyone if I just left. I did not have the counsel of my parents at that time. I was made to make that decision just there on my own, and I decided to leave. So yeah, technically I wasn't kicked out, except that I was sort of coerced into leaving.
Okay. And yeah, people, please feel free to, there's plenty of room. We have plenty of time for
And
questions.
ask anything.
Ask anything.
Really personal,
Yes,
invasive questions, welcome.
Linda asks you to discuss how the private school culture you experienced hasn't really changed the present day, or has it? I mean, obviously we hear constantly about sex scandals
Yeah.
in these schools.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's still, I mean, they're just, these stories are being slowly disgorged over time at these different schools. You know, I actually wrote a piece last week about the Babylon High School in Babylon, New York, and the Kate School, you know, and how the difference between, you know, what happens to abuse victims in a public school versus a private school. You know, in a public school, of course, there's accountability because it's part of a whole municipal structure. And in private school, basically, victims of abuse get swept under the rug, which I was for 30 years. And then, you know, when it's time for accountability, there's no structure to support accountability in the private schools. Like, you know, so a vague kind of mealy mouth, you know, general apology was finally offered by Buxton when we confronted a group of students, alumni, confronted them. I have never been apologized to specifically by the school after all these years. In 2011, 2016, there was an article in the Boston Globe. The Spotlight team did a feature on victims of abuse in private boarding schools, and I was part of that feature article. And I thought for sure that I would hear from the school after that. Nothing. They just squirmed away.
Linda also asked, discuss how your experiences informed your relationships with your own kids. In fact, at the end, you're taking one of your children to boarding school.
Yes.
Are there any updates?
Well, that child is now 26 years old.
Okay.
They survived. They wanted to go to boarding school in their junior year and applied themselves and got in and had a fantastic time. So even though I was full of trepidation, and, you know, a lot of this story, you know, I had at the time of the beginning of this book, two daughters who were the ages, my eldest was the age I was when all of this happened. Now my eldest is non-binary, so I don't refer to them in that way anymore. But at the time in 2008 and 2009, it was like I was being very triggered by watching. I was the eldest of two girls. I had these two girls. My eldest was going to be the age when I was sent. And I was looking at this child saying, oh my God, my mother threw me out of the house. You know, I could never do that to my kid. You know, I could never do that. And, you know, and my kids, although for sure went through the divorce, and it was a very difficult time. And it happened perfectly just as the eldest was starting high school and the younger was starting middle school. So as if life wasn't going to be hard enough for them, you know, their family just sort of blows up. Amazingly, they've turned out great. We're very close. And I think if I can take any credit for it, it's that, and then this is what my eldest Hazel said to me recently, was just, you know, whatever happens, you're always open-minded. You're always willing to hear our side of it, to consider the thing that we're telling you. I never feel like I'm going to be rejected by you for something that I think or I feel. And, you know, that to me that's success.
Yeah,
you know.
For sure. Okay, you have a craft question here, writing craft question. Noah asks, as a writer, how did you decide which specific language to use when creating dialogue in the memoir, as well as choosing language for details, like in describing the building in the passage you read? Yeah, just that, you know, well, I'm such a architecture real estate junkie that the description of the Dakota was in my sweet spot, but like, it just seemed absolutely masterful the way you just talked about the maze-like nature of the roof and the
Thank you.
passageways and all that. So did it come naturally, or were you fussing over that language?
Well, I mean, I fussed over this book for 12 years. So like nothing in there is in its first draft. Everything got dinked with endlessly. But in terms of writing dialogue, it's just really, I found myself just having to go into like a sort of almost a meditative place and like, all right, play some music that would like remind me of a time or whatever. And I would just sort of trick myself to be back in that place. And pretty much everything that's in the book they're all memories that are really vivid to me. There's nothing is made up in here. A dialogue obviously is remembered dialogue, so essentially made up. But all of the topics, everything in that chapter, I mean, I just vividly remember it. Max giving us this tour. And that's something that actually I've heard from a couple of people who knew Max Cantor and was like, that's him. You totally described him perfectly. So that was sort of gratifying. He sadly died a few years later. He was a totally brilliant journalist and was murdered in pursuit of a drug story in New York. And so, alas, he's no longer with us. But yeah, I mean, I just go into the place where I was, and I just look at the thing, and I try to find the most direct way to describe it. I don't know what.
So I see Joan has a question. Maybe I'll just sort of paraphrase. I mean, your father only died a few years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he was around and you were talking with him, presumably while you were working on this material. Did he know what you were up to? Did you talk with him about the content of the book?
Yeah, I mean, he did and he didn't. Sadly, the last years of his life were consumed by dementia. So one of the great sadnesses is that he lost his mind and he died before I published this book. I really wanted him to read it. My father never really understood what I was writing about or why it was important and why what happened to me at Buxton had so much resonance in my life. Whenever I would bring it up or bring up my childhood or things that would happen, he'd be like, honestly, Erika, I mean, when are you going to get over it? He just didn't, he was a brilliant man. He was unable to bring emotional imagination to women's lives. He did it brilliantly with men's lives. He was a biographer and he wrote biographies of several men. But when it came to his own daughter, like he never understood what happened to me and its significance. It was a real blind spot with him.
And you never tried to force him to understand? Were you just able to?
Oh, yes, I did.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I did. There were many dinners, where we would be like 1.5 martinis in, and I would, we would talk about things. And, and in fairness, I mean, he did apologize for a lot of it. I mean, but really by the time, I mean, I always knew that he loved me. So, and he was willing to talk about, he was a good talker about things. So, we could make it into dinner conversation, but he never really understood. And there's a scene at the end of the book that takes too much setting up for me to describe, but where like there's an op-ed in the New York Times that I talked to him about, and the whole thing clicks into place. And I just understand that as much as he loved me, he was part of this sort of patriarchal, artistic structure that sucked up girls' lives and chewed them up and spat them out in the name of male genius. And it's sort of a pivotal moment towards the end of the book. Yeah.
We haven't talked a lot about Sam Spade, aka James Ellroy. There's quite a bit about him in the book. If that component had not been in your life, if you had never met him, if that relationship had never taken place, what do you think this book would be?
That's a really good question, Megan. Very different. I mean, I would have ended, the book would have been a lot simpler. It would have been, one narrative trajectory, right? So I would have probably told the Buxton story and come away with, a lesson and some growth and some good reflective opportunities. And it's a pip of a story just on its own. The boarding school piece of it is full of crazy shit. And it would have been enough. And in fact, the second story made the whole thing way more awkward and sort of clumsy and hard, heavy lifting. It made it much heavier lifting. But all along, I felt like it was going to be worth it, that it was going to be a far deeper, more profound thing. Because really what I wanted people to understand is like what the long tail of shame is like, and how an event like this in the early part of a person's life just shapes them, whether they know it or not. And, it sort of answer the question, like everybody knows some girl who was like flirting with a teacher or slept with a camp counselor, whatever happened to her, I wonder. And, and this is sort of that story, she doesn't just disappear into the night. She ends up living an entire life that is shaped and complexified by her experience.
Okay, we just have a few more minutes. Another question. What draws you to writing memoirs in particular? What's the significance of memoirs to you in the overall literary landscape? What do they provide readers that other genres don't? I suppose other than the obvious. Are you I'm always a little sheepish about writing memoir.
I know it seems it's so solipsistic, isn't it? I mean, and my mother once devastatingly said to me when I told her I was writing a memoir, or when I told her she should write a memoir because she lived a fascinating life. And she said, "Oh yeah, right. Yes, I'll write a memoir. Here, you're going to love this. It's all about me." It's just so toxic. Anyway, what I love about memoir is that first of all, I think reality is fascinating, that we don't actually need to make anything up, that what the material just lying around on the ground is so fascinating and so complex and insane. Like if I had written this memoir as a novel, people, I'm sure reviews would have been, well, that's a sort of a stretch of, believability, right? But the fact is like life is really crazy. There's not one non-truth in my whole book. Everything in there really happened. I would like to try writing fiction. I feel intimidated by it, and I feel like I still have material that I can keep mining, but I am going to give it a shot. I'm going to try fiction in the next year or so.
Wow. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you, Erika.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody who came to this. I really appreciate having you here.
We had a pretty full house.
It was good. Yeah.
Thanks so much to both Erika and Megan for joining us on At Home with Literati. Reminder to buy The Big Hurt. The link is in the chat. But have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.